Toward the final years of Justinian's reign, around the mid-6th century, a people group known as the Avars began pushing into Europe. And as they migrated, they forced other steppe groups, such as the Hunyugur, the Sabirs, and various related tribes, to move westward. The king of the Alans, known to the Byzantines as Sarosios, managed to stay on good terms with them. To the Byzantines, the Avars looked a lot like the old Huns. Only difference was that the Avars wore their hair in two long braids that hung down their backs. These newcomers spoke a foreign tongue, demanded gold in exchange for peace, and rode fast like the Huns once did. Their arrival wasn't just another wave of nomads. It kicked off a chain reaction across the steppe. The tribes they pushed out ended up pressing against the borders of the Byzantine world and beyond, and threw the region into constant motion. When the Avars showed up at the empire's doorstep in 558, they didn't come begging. Instead, they demanded land, allies, and tribute. And the Byzantines, already stretched thin by wars with the Persians and the pressure of rebuilding after the plague, were in no position to fight them off outright. So Emperor Justinian paid them off. But the Avars didn't settle down quietly. By the 560s, they had allied themselves with the remnants of various Turkic and Hunnic groups and were starting to build something bigger. They moved into the Carpathian Basin and began shaping it into their own base of power. And from there, the Avars would raid, negotiate, and fight their way through the Balkans, and would regularly clash with the Byzantines for the next 2 centuries. But before we move forward into their history with more details, let's get to know who these people were and what we know about them. So long before they appeared on the Danube, a people calling themselves the Avars roamed the western edges of the Eurasian steppe. Our main window onto their story comes from 2 Byzantine writers, Priscus in the mid-5th century and Theophylactus Simocatta around 600 AD. Around 463 AD, the historian Priscus gives us the earliest clear mention of a group called the Avars. He reports that the Avar raids drove the Sabirs from their homes, and in turn, those Sabirs displaced the Ogurs, Onagurs, and Saragurs toward the Caucasus and the Black Sea. By 527 to 565, under Emperor Justinian, a small clan possibly consisting of warlords slipped west into Europe. They called themselves the Avars, and also took on the title of Kagan. Local steppe tribes like Barsals, Onagurs, and Sabirs mistook them for the legendary Avars and paid them tribute. Theophylactus Simocatta makes an interesting point about these people. According to him, the original Avars were probably the Rurans, a powerful group who ruled Mongolia through most of the 400s, until they got completely wiped out by the Gokturks in 552. And these so-called Avars who showed up in Europe later were not them. They were something else. Theophylactus calls them false Avars, people pretending to be the fearsome Rurans to inherit their prestigious name. He then goes on to make his point that the false Avars were the newcomers in Europe that consisted of 2 main hordes, the War and the Zuni. This whole notion that the Avars in Pannonia were not the real Avar, but the fugitive remnants of the Rurans polity, comes from certain passages in the letter of the Turk Kagan, sent to the Byzantine Emperor Maurice, which is preserved in the account of Theophylactus Simocatta, in which the Kagan goes on to warn that the barbarians who dwell towards Europe and Pannonia are not to be considered the true Avars, and that these barbarians have falsely embraced the name Avars. Modern scholars have pointed out that the real Avars, the ones in Central and Inner Asia, were made up of tribes like the War and the Zuni, both of which were connected to earlier groups like the Rurans and the Hephthalites. So while Theophylactus got some facts right, he didn't realize that the people pretending to be Avars in Europe may have actually included real members of these older Central Asian groups, but mixed in with others. We still don't know for sure which of those confederations among War and Zuni formed the core of the Avar group that settled in Europe. But what we do know, thanks to physical anthropology, is that the ruling class of the European Avars had clear Central or Inner Asian features. These were probably the original Avars, and they formed the aristocracy. Over time, as they migrated west, they picked up other groups along the way, from the Eurasian steppes and from areas they passed through, including the Balkans and Pannonia. These included Turkic Bulgar groups, Germanic tribes, and Iranian-speaking peoples. The Avars first appeared at the edge of the Byzantine world in the mid-6th century. Driven westward after the Turks crushed their political ancestors, these Avars came with their families, horses, and reputation as prestigious people. They reached the lands near the Alans in the Caucasus and sent envoys to Emperor Justinian in Constantinople. In 557, their ambassador named Kandik appeared before Emperor Justinian for the very first time, demanding land and tribute. Byzantium's old strategy had always been simple: use one dangerous group to deal with another. The Emperor Justinian gave the Avars gifts and pushed them, through diplomacy and incentive, to attack those tribes that had long harassed the empire's borders. These included the Onagurs, Zali, Sabirs, Kutrigurs, and Kutrigurs, all groups that had been demanding tribute or crossing into Roman territory. Backed by both military strength and their fast-growing reputation as fierce newcomers, they defeated these tribes one by one. Some were crushed outright, while others submitted without a fight. The Kutrigurs and Kutrigurs Huns were not only beaten, but also assimilated into their own horde. It was one of those moments where the old steppe pattern repeated itself, a rising nomadic power consuming what remained of a previous one. Among the worst hit were the Slavic Ontes, who lived north of the Black Sea. Avar raids devastated their lands. Many of the Slavs were captured and sold into slavery. The Avar elite knew how to work diplomacy as well. They played both sides when needed. First they helped the Byzantines, then later they turned on them. By 560, they already had a dominion that extended from the Volga to the mouth of the Danube. One Avar leader, known to us as Bayan, emerges in the historical record around 562. He would be the one to truly solidify the Avars' place in European history. Bayan led the Avars west, asking permission from the Byzantines to settle inside imperial lands. Justinian dodged the issue diplomatically. But when Justin II took over in 565, he cut off negotiations and refused to pay the Avars their usual subsidies. Bayan then responded with force. He launched raids that reached as far as the Elbe and clashed with Frankish King Sigbert of Austrasia, but was beaten and forced back. But the key moment came in 567, when Bayan allied with the Lombards to destroy the Gepids, a Germanic kingdom that stood in their way. After the Gepid king Cunimund was killed in battle, the Avars took his territory. When the Lombards migrated to Italy soon after, Bayan moved into the western Carpathian Basin without any hindrance. By 568, the Avars had secured their base in Central Europe. Between the Byzantines and the Avars, there was always a back and forth between them. Around 570 or 571, there was a peace deal, and in 574, war again broke out between them. As soon as power was handed over to Tiberius, he restored peace with 80,000 gold coins a year. Despite earlier deals with the Byzantines, Bayan betrayed them in 579. He built a bridge across the Sava River near the strategic city of Sirmium, swearing it was only to fight the Slavs. But once the bridge was complete, he demanded the city to be surrendered. After 3 years of siege, the Byzantines gave in 582. Sirmium was lost, and Byzantium was again forced to pay the Avars an annual tribute of 80,000 gold coins. From that point forward, the Avars acted like a permanent threat hanging over the Balkans. With the Byzantines distracted by a war with Persia, there was little resistance. Avar raids reached deep into the empire, even laying siege to Thessalonica around 586. Interestingly, the Avars taxed the local Balkan population less than the Byzantine administration had, possibly to win favor or simply out of practical governance. But still, their rule was brutal when needed. The Avars didn't operate alone. They often worked with Slavic tribes, sometimes as allies, and sometimes as overlords. These partnerships were opportunistic. When it suited them, the Avars fought alongside the Slavs against Byzantium. At other times, they fought the Slavs themselves. But over time, the Slavs grew more independent and began settling in lands for good. While Avar raids were about plunder, Slavic incursions led to long-term settlement and cultural shifts across the Balkans. The turning point came in 626. The Avars, Slavs, and Persians joined forces in an ambitious siege of Constantinople itself. They failed. That defeat marked the beginning of a slow but steady decline in Avar's power. In the years that followed, the Avars faced new problems. A Frankish merchant named Samo helped organize a revolt among the Western Slavs. Meanwhile, in the steppes north of the Black Sea, a leader named Kubrat formed a powerful Bulgar confederation that challenged Avar's influence. So the Avars were now squeezed from multiple directions. By the 630s, they lost their grip on lands near the Danube Delta to Kubrat's son Asparuk. The Avar Khaganate was now trapped between rising powers, the Bulgars on one side and the expanding Khazar Empire on the other. Their internal politics also began to shatter. Around 631, the Bulgars demanded that one of their own take over the Avar throne. The resulting conflict weakened the Avar state, and although they won the civil war, the damage done was lasting. Their power kept shrinking. From around 680 to 780, the historical record becomes thin. This dark century of Avar's history is marked by silence in many sources. What we do know suggests a slow decline. A few missionary efforts were attempted from the Frankish world, but even those were often turned back due to ongoing war. Avars still controlled land and collected taxes, but their influence was fading. Then came Charlemagne. In the 790s, the Franks launched a major campaign against the Avars. The war lasted nearly a decade. In 802, the Avar stronghold in Pannonia was finally broken. Some Avars remained, often lumped together with Slavs in Frankish documents. They continued to appear here and there in treaties, in missionary efforts, but no longer as an independent force. In the east, the Bulgar ruler Krum destroyed the last remnants of Avar statehood by around 805, taking over their salt mines and remaining territories. By the 820s, the Avar Khagan was gone. What remained were scattered Avar-Slav communities, ruled by local chiefs under Frankish authority. Over time, even those remnants blended into the surrounding populations. For all the power the Avars held in Europe, especially in the Carpathian Basin, we still don't know for sure what language they spoke. There are no surviving books, letters, or inscriptions we can definitely read as Avar. We're left with just fragments like names, titles, and some possible words preserved in Greek or Latin sources. Some have wondered whether today's Avars in Dagestan might be linked to the Danubian Avars. It's tempting, but there's no solid evidence. Languages can change over centuries, and we can't be sure that the people in Dagestan today are actually descendants of the steppe Avars. What most scholars do agree on is that the language of the Danubian Avars probably belonged to the Altaic family. That includes Turkic, Mongolic, and possibly Tungusic languages. But here's where it gets tricky. Even within that family, it's not clear whether the Avar ruling class was closer to the Mongols or the Turkic Bulgars. The titles used in the Avar state give us some clues. Words like Khagan, Tudun, Ugris, Kapkan, and Tarkhan show up not just among Avars, but also in other Altaic cultures, like the early Turks, Uyghurs, and Proto-Bulgars. That suggests that the Avars were part of the same cultural and political world as those peoples, or at least borrowed from it heavily. We also have a handful of names passed down in sources: Bayan, Koch, Apsic, Targits, Bukalabras, and others. Most of them look Altaic in origin. Bayan, for instance, means rich in Turkic and Mongolic languages. Koch probably comes from the Turkic word for blue. In some cases, it's even possible that these names were actually titles or ranks that the Greek or Latin chroniclers misunderstood as personal names. Take Bukalabras, for example. He was an Avar shaman who got into trouble after falling in love with one of the Khagan's wives. He tried to flee to the Turkic Empire, but was caught by the Byzantines. The Avars demanded him back. His name might not have been a name at all. It could have meant something like chief sorcerer or head shaman. In the regions they conquered, they came across Gepids, Bulgars, Lombards, Slavs, and possibly even Romanized locals from the old provinces of the Roman Empire. The Gepids are especially important. They were defeated by the Avars in 567, but their population remained in the area. Some even rose to high positions under Avar's rule. A name like Cunimund, for example, which appears in Greek sources as the name of an Avar envoy, may actually have been a Gepid name Cunimund, which was likely misheard or misspelled by Byzantine scribes. Later on, Christian Gepids even helped Byzantine campaigns against Slavic rebels. In some cases, former enemies of the Avars ended up serving in their ranks. We also know that the Avars captured and relocated hundreds of thousands of people during their raids, especially from the Balkans. Some of these captives brought Roman traditions and Christianity into Avar lands. So when archaeologists find Roman-style artifacts in Avar cemeteries, it doesn't necessarily mean there was a local Roman population. It could just as easily reflect the culture of war captives. When it comes to understanding the Avars, archaeology fills in the gaps left by the limited written sources. But even archaeology comes with challenges. Experts often disagree not just on dates or which ethnic group a grave belonged to, but even on how to interpret the graves themselves. And part of the problem is that we haven't done enough digging. Thousands of Avar graves have been found across Hungary, the heartland of their former empire, but very few of their major cemeteries have been properly excavated using modern methods. Their settlements are even more elusive. What we do know comes mostly from a few hurried excavations like at Dunajvaros, where traces of huts and defensive trenches were found. A more promising site is being uncovered at Kolkid, but much remains unknown. There are some things that we can be more confident about. For example, how Avar warriors were buried tells us a lot about their society. A typical Avar man, especially one of status, was buried with a belt decorated according to his rank. Arrows were often placed beside the body to show he was a warrior. Wealthier graves, probably those belonging to nobles or princes, included swords, quivers, gold or silver decorated belts, and even ceremonial drinking vessels like rhytons and cups. Interestingly, after the mid-7th century, these high-status graves become much harder to find. Some believe that this reflects a change in Avar society, possibly a decline in central leadership or a shift in burial customs. Many simpler graves lack the fancy belt fittings, and some archaeologists think these might have belonged to serfs or lower-status individuals, which shows that Avar society was divided by class. The earliest Avar graves rarely date earlier than 600 AD. That suggests that the Avars didn't have permanent winter quarters before then. They were still living the full nomadic lifestyle, migrating, raiding, and herding livestock. But over time, they settled down. By the late 600s and 700s, they began establishing permanent camps and villages. Graveyards grew larger, some with hundreds or even thousands of graves, which points to stable and long-term communities. Still, signs of the old nomadic way remained. Grave goods like leather tools, fire strikers, and animal hide bottles show that pastoralism remained an important part of their lifestyle. The Avars favored the moist plains of the Carpathian Basin, which were excellent for grazing. And yet, slowly but surely, they adopted agriculture. Graves from this later period include sickles, axes, and even chicken bones and eggshells, likely placed as symbols of fertility or rebirth. These findings point to a more settled and mixed economy. In the late Avar period, likely in the 8th century, new groups from the east arrived. These tribes brought with them a new style of belt ornamentation, often decorated with griffins and vine patterns. Compared to the earlier Avars, they seem to have been less advanced economically, and their arrival may reflect another wave of migrations or political changes within the Avar world. Economically, things were changing. Early on, the Avars used Byzantine coins and even made local counterfeits. But later, coins largely disappear from the archaeological record. That could mean that the Avar economy shifted toward a barter system, that is, trading goods instead of money, and this was probably due to fewer raids and less contact with the Byzantine Empire. Early Avar belt ornaments often had geometric marks, probably symbols that marked family or lineage, which is called tribal tamgas. These became more naturalistic over time, with images of griffins and other animals. Scholars suggest that this may be due to a move away from a tightly organized clan system toward a looser and more totemic worldview, where myth and ancestry became more symbolic than structured. This is one of many signs that Avar society changed over time, but didn't break completely from its roots. Tribal bonds still mattered, because belief systems remained steeped in steppe traditions. We don't know much about the Avar religion, at least not from written records. The few things mentioned in Byzantine sources are vague and often filtered through a Christian lens. Avars are described as bringing idols into battle, only for those idols to fail when facing Christian enemies. That kind of storytelling was common in Christian writings and doesn't tell us much about what the Avars themselves believed. But archaeology offers us something more of a solid view, actual objects that give us a sense of their spiritual world. One of the most striking finds is a bone jar from Mokran, carved with deep symbolic meaning. On it, you see a world mountain, a tree of life with 9 branches, and a world column, surrounded by the sun, the moon, and mythical animals. These symbols are not random decoration. They tie directly into the kind of shamanic belief systems found across the Eurasian steppe. The number 9, for instance, often shows up in steppe shamanism as a sacred number. Other finds reinforce this picture, like antler salt cellars, decorated with horse figures wearing bull masks, which might have represented shamanic duels or rituals. One late Avar belt ornament even shows a dragon alongside other symbolic creatures. So while we don't have religious texts or temples, the Avars clearly had a spiritual system rooted in the steppe traditions, one that revolved around nature, ancestry, and cosmic order. Their world was likely filled with spirits, omens, and powerful symbols, guided by shamans. And their beliefs were not isolated. The craftsmanship of some ritual objects shows influence from Byzantine or even Persian styles. So, Avar religion wasn't organized or temple-based like Christianity or Islam, but it was vivid, symbolic, and deeply connected to the natural and spiritual forces that they believed shaped their world. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching.